The rain fell in sheets, hammering against the pavement like 1,000 tiny drummers. Esther Chin pushed through the diner's back door with a bag of trash clutched against her hip, already thinking about the things she always thought about at midnight. Her aching feet, the studio apartment 3 blocks away, the way her shoulders had locked up somewhere around hour 8 of her shift. She'd been working at Neon's diner for 4 years, and the late-night closing had become a kind of meditation. The muscle memory of wiping counters, of restocking napkins, of counting the register with her eyes half closed. The trash bag made a wet sound as it landed in the bin. She was already turning back toward the door, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done before she could leave. Wipe the kitchen counters. Lock up. Walk home in the rain. Sleep. Do it all again tomorrow night. The routine had become her armor against the uncertainty of the world, a series of small, manageable tasks that made her feel like she had some control over her life. She didn't notice the figure at first. The alley behind the diner was poorly lit, a streetlight 2 blocks down that cast more shadow than illumination, a neon beer sign from the closed bar across the way that turned everything the color of old bruises. Esther had walked this path hundreds of times. She knew every crack in the pavement, every spot where water collected, the particular smell of wet concrete and the dumpster on the corner that never quite stopped smelling like old fish. But tonight there was something else. A sound that didn't belong. Not quite a cry, not quite a whimper, but something caught between the two, a desperate, hitching breath of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. She froze. The trash bag still in her hand. Her keys already in her pocket, still warm from her apron. Hello? No response. Just that breathing, shallow and wrong, coming from the corner where the shadows pooled thickest, where the brick wall of the diner met the brick wall of the abandoned building next door. She'd never paid attention to that corner before. It was just empty space, just part of the landscape of closing time. Now it wasn't empty. Esther took a step forward. Then another. Her body moved before her brain caught up, before she could think about statistics or safety or the very reasonable reasons to turn around and call 911 from inside the diner. Some part of her had always leaned toward suffering. Even as a child, she'd been the kind of person who couldn't walk past an injured bird, who had to stop and try to help even when she didn't know what she was doing. The figure came into focus slowly. A man. Tall, lean in the way that suggested muscle rather than softness, wearing what had probably once been an expensive suit, though it was torn now. Badly torn. There was blood on the fabric, dark and wet in the alley's strange light. His head was tilted back against the brick, eyes closed, but his breathing, that impossible hitching breath, told her he was still conscious, still aware, still holding on to something. It took her a moment to understand what that something was. There was a child in his arms. A small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair plastered to her skull with rain and something else. Her skin was a shade or two lighter than Esther's own, and her eyes, God, her eyes were enormous and full of the kind of terror that belonged on a face far older than that. The girl wasn't crying anymore, but her body was rigid with the kind of fear that transcends sound. Her small hand was gripping the man's shirt so tightly that Esther could see her knuckles had gone white. The man's arm was wrapped around her protectively, pulling her close to his chest in a way that suggested he would absorb her terror if he could. His other hand was pressed against his side, and Esther understood without looking closely that this was where the blood was coming from. Not just the shoulder, though there was blood there too. The side. The place where it mattered most. Oh my God, Esther breathed. The man's eyes opened. Just barely. Just enough for her to see that they were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. For a moment, his gaze focused on her with an intensity that made her want to step backward. She saw calculation there, threat assessment, the kind of clarity you didn't expect from someone who was actively bleeding out. He looked at her like he was trying to figure out if she was a danger or a solution. If helping him was worth the price she would pay. His lips moved. No sound came out. He tried again, and this time she heard a single word, rough and halting, please. That word. That one word from a man she'd never seen before in her life. A man who was clearly running from something terrible, asking for help from a stranger in an alley at midnight. It would have been easy to walk away. It would have been the smart choice. It would have been the choice that kept her safe, kept her life predictable, kept her in the comfortable routine she'd built for herself. But Esther Chin had never been particularly good at making the smart choice when someone was suffering. She dropped the trash bag and moved toward him. Up close, the situation was worse than it had appeared. The blood on his shirt was spreading, the small girl's breath was coming in shallow little gasps, and his skin had taken on a grayish quality that suggested he was very close to passing out. Or worse. She ducked under his arm, the one not holding the child, and felt the weight of him settle across her shoulders. He was heavy, all muscle and gravity, and the blood on his clothes was warm and wet against her side. The little girl pressed against his chest, trembling, her fingers still gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Come on," Esther said, not sure if she was talking to him or herself, not sure about anything except that she couldn't leave them here. "We're going inside." They stumbled back toward the diner's rear entrance, 3 people moving as one awkward unit through the rain. Esther's mind was spinning through the implications of what she was about to do. The liability, the complications, the very real possibility that she was about to make a terrible decision. But her body was already moving, already committed, already locked into a course of action that would change everything. The door swung open. The warmth of the diner spilled out into the alley. Behind them, the rain continued its relentless hammering. Ahead of them lay the familiar kitchen, the empty dining room, the life Esther had built for herself in careful, small pieces. She brought them inside and let the door close behind her, sealing off the alley, the rain, and any chance of going back to the way things had been 5 minutes ago. Old Torres, the night manager, looked up from wiping the counter. Torres had worked at Neon's longer than anyone, nearly 15 years. He'd seen all kinds of people come through that diner. He looked at the 3 of them, the bleeding man, the terrified child, the waitress supporting both of them, and something in his face remained perfectly, deliberately neutral. Torres didn't ask questions. He'd worked this neighborhood long enough to know that some things were better left alone. He dried his hands on his apron, nodded once at Esther in a way that might have meant approval or might have meant nothing at all, and went back to wiping the counter as if nothing unusual was happening. That small gesture, that tacit agreement to look the other way, might have saved them all. Esther brought King and the child to the back storage area. Old supplies, boxes, no windows. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed slightly, casting everything in a pale, clinical glow. She helped the man, she would learn his name was King, sit carefully against the wall, and then she did something she'd seen nurses do on television, something she had no formal training for but had read about in a book once. She stripped away his jacket slowly, carefully, and assessed the damage with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. 2 gunshot wounds. One in the shoulder, the bullet having passed through cleanly, she hoped. One in his side, lower, more serious. Not immediately fatal but dangerous. Blood was still seeping from both, soaking through the expensive fabric of his shirt. She found the diner's first aid kit, kept for employee accidents, burns and minor cuts, and realized immediately that it was inadequate for what she was facing. But it was all she had, so she worked with it. The girl watched everything, still crying silently, her eyes never leaving King's face. Esther spoke to her gently, giving her small tasks to occupy her hands and mind. Hold this cloth, stay close to King, help me by staying brave. It was busy work, pure and simple, but it gave the child something to do besides panic. It gave her a sense of agency in a situation where she had none. King's consciousness wavered in and out like a radio signal going in and out of range. In moments of clarity he watched Esther work. She was competent, steady, not panicked. Despite her obvious lack of medical training, there was something capable about the way she moved, the way she didn't hesitate or second-guess herself. She was gentle with the child even in the midst of crisis. He'd never met anyone like her before, someone who helped without calculation, without asking what it would cost, without an agenda lurking beneath the surface. "Who shot you?" Esther asked as she cleaned the first wound with supplies pulled from the kit and water heated in the diner's kitchen. "People who want me dead," King said, his voice barely a whisper, each word costing him effort. "Is the child yours?" Esther pressed, not out of judgment but because she needed to understand the situation, because knowing the truth would help her protect them both. "She's mine," he said, and there was something absolute and final in his tone that made her understand. "Don't ask again. Don't question the nature of that relationship. Don't suggest alternatives. She is mine, and I would die rather than let harm come to her." Esther worked through the night. She improvised bandages from cloth she found in the storage area, clean but not sterile. She found antiseptic wipes in the first aid kit and used them carefully, aware that infection could be as dangerous as the bullets themselves. It wasn't surgical, wasn't professional, but it was enough to stop the bleeding. King's breathing stabilized as the hours passed. The girl, Lillian, she would learn later, fell asleep curled against his chest around 3 in the morning, her small hand still gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Torres left at 2 o'clock, his shift over, and he didn't come back. He didn't tell anyone. He simply left, and Esther understood that he was offering her a choice. She could call the police now, could wash her hands of this situation while she still could. Or she could stay. Hours passed. The diner closed. The kitchen lights were shut off. The dining room fell silent except for the occasional sound of a car passing on the street outside. Esther sat in the storage area with King, who drifted between sleep and wakefulness, and she realized something that terrified her more than the blood, more than the danger, more than the sound of his labored breathing. She wasn't trapped. She could leave right now. She could walk upstairs to the manager's office, call 911, and explain that she'd found an injured man and a child in the alley. She could go home and let the authorities handle it. By tomorrow afternoon, this would all be someone else's problem. She could return to her regular life, her predictable routine, the careful walls she'd built around her heart. But she didn't want to. And that realization unsettled her more than anything else. When King woke near dawn, there was no threat in his gaze anymore. Just exhaustion and something else. A kind of desperate recognition, as if he was seeing in her a reflection of something he'd thought was impossible in himself. "Why didn't you call the police?" he asked quietly. Esther considered the question seriously. She could have been lying to herself. She could have said something noble about protecting a child, about the failings of the system. But she thought about what would happen if she called 911. This man would be arrested. This child would be taken from him, placed in the system, separated from the only person she apparently trusted. Would they help her? Esther asked instead. No, he said quietly. They'd take her. Foster care. Questions. She'd lose me and I'd lose her, and people I owe more than I can repay would use her as leverage. He told her then, not everything but enough. Lillian's parents had been killed when she was younger, murdered in a situation connected to his world, his choices, his life. He'd found her alone and terrified, and he'd made a silent vow. He would keep her alive. He would protect her. It didn't matter what it cost him. There were people who wanted to use Lillian to control him, or worse, to erase her as a way to break him. He couldn't go to a hospital. They'd report his injuries to the police, and the police would ask questions he couldn't answer. He couldn't call anyone in his organization. They'd see Lillian as a problem, a liability, a weakness to be exploited or eliminated. He had nowhere safe. No one to trust. Until Esther. "How long can you stay here?" she asked. "Not long. They'll look for me. I have enemies who won't stop looking. When they find me, they find her," King said, and the weight of those words hung between them like a funeral bell. "Then we move you before they look," Esther said. Even as the words came out of her mouth, she understood the magnitude of what she was saying. The pronoun shift. Not "you move." "We move." She was locking herself in, making herself complicit, trading her safe, predictable life for something uncertain and dangerous. "Because Lillian reaches for me," Esther said simply. "Because you're still bleeding under those bandages. Because someone has to witness that you're not just a criminal, you're a man trying to protect a child. And that matters. It has to matter." King didn't respond immediately. When he finally did speak, his voice was rough. "I've spent my entire life building an empire. Building power. Building fear. And now I'd burn it all down for a 6-year-old girl. Maybe that's not a weakness," Esther said quietly. "Maybe that's the moment you became human." Something in King broke open at those words. He looked at her like she'd given him permission to grieve, to mourn the life he was about to leave behind, to acknowledge the cost of choosing a child over everything he'd built. The danger escalated. One of King's safe houses was found and burned. Information Esther overheard, fragments of conversation, code words and text messages, told her the noose was tightening. The hunters were closing in. Esther realized that staying with him was no longer passive. It was becoming active resistance against the machine of his world. Then his enemies found the diner. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of an ordinary shift. Men arrived, 3 of them sharp-eyed and professional. They asked for King. Torres was working the counter and deflected smoothly, saying no one by that name had been there. But the men were persistent and they were threatening. One of them pulled Torres aside and spoke to him in low tones, and Esther could see Torres's jaw tighten. She was hidden with King and Lillian in the storage area, and she listened to the conversation through the thin door. She heard Torres denying everything. She heard the men threatening him. She heard the terrible clarity of understanding. They would kill everyone in this diner to get to King. They would kill Torres without hesitation. They would kill her. They would take Lillian and use her as leverage or worse. King realized it too. She could feel the shift in him, the hardening of his resolve. "We have to go," he said quietly. "Now." Before they searched the back. He was still wounded, still not fully healed. The bandages covering his shoulder and side would need to be changed soon. Walking would be painful. But there was no choice. Esther wrapped Lillian in a coat while King stood, steadying himself against the wall. She could see the pain on his face, not just the physical pain of moving with bullet wounds, but the pain of watching his world implode, of watching the place where they'd found temporary safety about to become a trap. They exited through the kitchen, into the alley, into the rain again. Full circle, but with everything changed. The alley that had been the beginning of all this was now the passageway to everything that would come next. They moved through the city, borrowed car, hidden safe house, then another. Esther had become his driver, his lookout, his accomplice in his disappearance. But she'd also become something else, the person he trusted most in the world. The only person he could rely on completely. One night, in a small apartment that smelled like other people's lives and unfamiliar cooking, King and Esther had a conversation that neither of them could take back. "Come with me," King said. "Come with both of us, with Lillian. Leave the city. Leave everything. Start over somewhere they'll never think to look." Esther's breath caught. "To where?" "Somewhere they can't find us," he said. "Somewhere I can just be her father. Somewhere you can just be." He paused, searching for the right word. "Hers." "And who would I be?" Esther asked, because she needed to hear him say it. "Someone she trusts. Someone I trust," he said quietly. "The person who saw me bleeding in an alley and didn't run." It wasn't a love confession, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper and more complicated, a recognition of mutual survival, mutual choice, mutual transformation. They had saved each other by saving Lillian. They had found something to live for by being present for her. They had become something other than what they were before through the simple act of choosing to help. King's organization demanded a response. His lieutenant called, his voice tight with controlled anger. He threatened to take everything, King's money, his territories, his legacy, if he didn't surrender or die. The choice was framed as simple: come back and face consequences or lose everything you've built. King listened to every word. Then he said nothing and hung up. "What will you do?" Esther asked. "I'm already dead," King said, and there was a strange peace in his voice. "The man I was, the crime boss, the one who ruled through fear, that person is gone. He died the moment I held Lillian in that alley. That man would never have let a child's crying stop him. That man would never have chosen vulnerability over power. That man is dead, and I'm not going to resurrect him just to satisfy his enemies." It was a moment of radical clarity. He'd spent years building an empire, and he would dismantle it entirely for one child and a waitress who saw him vulnerable. But letting go wasn't simple. He had people who depended on him. He had obligations. He had blood on his hands from choices he made, and people would die because he was leaving. Power vacuums would be filled by worse people. Violence would continue without his hand to guide it, perhaps even more brutal than before. Esther watched him wrestle with this understanding. "Some people will die because you're leaving," she said. "Yes," he acknowledged. "Can you live with that?" "No," he said quietly. "But I can live with Lillian dead if I stay, and I can't do that. So I choose the guilt I might survive." He made calls. He orchestrated his own disappearance carefully, methodically, minimizing chaos. He transferred money to accounts in different names, accounts that would take years to trace. He arranged papers, new identities, a path out. And through it all, Esther was there. Not as a hostage or obligation, but as a witness to his transformation. 3 days before they planned to leave, King found Esther alone in the kitchen of their temporary apartment. "I need to know now," he said. "Are you coming with us or are you staying?" It was a practical question with profound implications. Esther had a life, a family, a job, a city she knew. She had a choice he'd never had the luxury of making. "If I leave, I can never come back," she said, speaking the fear aloud. "Not really. They'll be looking for us." "Yes." "I'll lose my job, my apartment, probably my safety for years." "Yes." "And you're still asking?" "I'm not asking for me," King said. "I'm asking for Lillian. She trusts you. She reaches for you when she's scared. If you don't come, she'll spend her life wondering why you disappeared. Why the person who saved her couldn't stay." He paused, his voice becoming softer. "But I'm also asking for me. Because I don't know how to be human without you. And I need to learn." Esther thought about the woman she'd been just days ago, the waitress counting tips, living quietly, untouched by the world's violence. That woman was gone. She had died the moment Esther stepped into the alley and heard a child crying. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow. Before dawn," King said. She cried later, alone in the bathroom with the door locked, grieving the life she was leaving. She called her cousin, not explaining, just saying goodbye. She wrote a resignation letter to the diner, knowing it would confuse and upset Torres and the other people who cared about her. She didn't say where she was going or why. She just thanked them for 4 years of work and said she had to go. She packed one bag with documents, photographs, the tangible proof of who she was. Birth certificate, social security card, a photograph of her parents, a few pieces of jewelry. Everything else she left behind. Everything else was part of the life she was choosing to abandon. Then she slept, knowing she'd wake up as someone else entirely. Before dawn they left. King drove. Lillian slept between them, her small body curled against the window. Esther watched the city disappear in the rearview mirror. The diner, the alley, the streets she'd walked for years, the life she'd built for herself in careful, small pieces. It felt like death, but it also felt like waking up. They crossed borders, passed through small towns, became unremarkable travelers. Esther realized she'd never left the city. She'd never seen mountains or open sky or roads that stretched endlessly forward. The world was larger than she'd known. They settled eventually in a small town near water, somewhere that felt far enough away, ordinary enough that no one looked twice at a man with a scarred shoulder inside, a young woman, and a small girl who called them both family. King became someone else. A father, a man who worked with his hands, who came home at night with dirt under his fingernails and read to Lillian before bed. Esther found work at a small cafe, began building a new life piece by piece. Lillian started school. She made friends. She grew. Time passed. Scars faded, though not completely. Some marks never disappear. But there were still moments when King looked out the window and Esther knew he was thinking about the life he'd abandoned. The people he'd left behind. The empire that would outlive him in some form, transformed by his absence into something he might not even recognize. There was grief in his eyes sometimes, the weight of choices made and unmade. And there were moments when Esther wondered if she'd made the right choice. If she should have stayed in her safe, predictable world. If she was responsible for the consequences of helping him disappear. But then Lillian reached for her hand, or King looked at her across the dinner table like she was the only real thing he'd ever owned, and she knew there was no choice. There was only the moment she'd stepped into an alley and saw someone who needed her. Lillian had a birthday. They had a small cake from the bakery in town. King put candles on it, and his hands shook slightly, the hands of a man who used to kill people, now trembling over birthday candles. Esther watched him, and there was no romance in the moment, no dramatic resolution. There was just the weight of survival, the reality of transformation, and the everyday miracles of a child growing up safe because a waitress heard crying in an alley. I used to wonder, Esther thought, what would have happened if I'd called 911 that night? If I'd chosen safety instead of compassion. But I understand now that there was never a choice. The moment I heard that child crying, I became the kind of person who had to help. And if becoming that person meant losing everything else, then that was the trade I was willing to make. I'm not a hero. I'm not even particularly brave. I'm just a woman who looked at a dying man holding a terrified child and recognized something I couldn't walk away from. And so I didn't. She reached over and took King's hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers, understanding completely what he'd sacrificed and what he'd gained. Lillian blew out her candles, made a wish, and smiled in a way that held both the weight of her past and the light of a possible future. Outside, the world continued. People made their choices. Lives were lived and lost and transformed. In this small town by the water, 3 people who had found each other in darkness chose to build something bright together, knowing it might never be safe, knowing it was worth it anyway. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe.